I'm Golnaz Golnaraghi, and I'd like to talk to you about an elephant in the room that we must address. We may not be ignoring this elephant intentionally, but it sits in the confines of our organizations and workplaces, and it's been there for a while, growing and taking up space. By not addressing it, we are sending a message of complicity, and all the while patting ourselves on the back and for making progress. This elephant that we have ignored for far too long is that our workplace programs are not working for all women. In fact, these programs are failing Black, Indigenous, and racialized women. The reality is that many companies have spent the last few years investing in DEI initiatives, in creating mentorship and sponsorship programs to accelerate the careers of racialized and Indigenous women. And what the data tells us is that we have a lot of work still ahead of us. We're making progress, but we have a long way to go. A Diversity Institute study right here in Toronto showed that white identifying women across major Canadian cities are advancing into senior leadership roles at a much faster rate than women of color. In Toronto, that ratio is 7-1. We could say this is progress. We could say that we're advancing gender equity, but in reality, it isn't. In Canada, women of color represent 17% of entry-level positions, yet when we look at senior roles, that number is 6%. And depending on the community, there's variances, and it can be quite lower than that as well. So what we're seeing, there's a lot of factors that contribute to the numbers that I talked about and the issues that I talk about, but I'd like to focus on two things specifically tonight: the under-mentoring, the under-sponsorship of racialized and Indigenous women, as well as the prevalence of white saviorism in these programs. So a Lenin report stated that 60% of women of color have never had a strong interaction with senior leaders in their organization, which, if we think about it, results in many having mentors that may be at lower levels within workplaces with less influence and power. And of course, what happens is that contributes to a systemic sponsorship gap. And recently, Rosalind Chow, who's a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, wrote that many leaders often think they're sponsoring racialized people when in fact they're just mentoring them. So the inability to differentiate between these two concepts can have really detrimental effects on careers. Mentorship tends to be passive and private. Sponsorship tends to be more active and public. So the investments that we think we're making can really never be realized because we're failing to sponsor women of color in the same way that we sponsor our white identifying colleagues. So I love research. As someone who has their research degree, Ritu Basin, who's based right here in Toronto, and her colleagues studied sponsorship behaviors in Canada, and they found that people of color and Indigenous people are more likely to receive advice from leaders that serve to help fix the way they're perceived in the workplace, while their white colleagues are receiving advocacy that ultimately really has an impact on promotions and advancements in the workplace. So the prevalence of white supremacy and saviorism stem from an entire way of seeing and thinking about women of color, people of color, that is stemmed in attempts to rescue, to save, to fix, to assimilate. And we need to understand how saviorism culture is at play within our workplaces and institutions. And despite what colonization may have us wanting to believe, women of color, racialized women, Indigenous women, we do not need to be saved or rescued, and we certainly don't need fixing. The troubling thing is that these problems have been around for quite some time, and they have been around for decades and impacted many of us, myself included. In fact, many of you in this room, some of you in this room may have had impact as well. This is what motivated me to create Accelerate Her Future, and we often, as entrepreneurs, as change makers, create solutions that we wish we had as well. So, How do we solve the problem of under-mentoring and under-sponsorship? First, how we design our programs in our workplaces really matter. Are we taking a by us, for us approach, or are we taking a for them approach? For example, when you think about programs in your own current workplaces or organizations, who was at the core of their development? Who sat at decision-making tables? Who dictated, designed, and dominated the programming? If these programs are developed by a homogeneous group who lack the lived experience to inform needs and gaps, and ultimately designing the programs, then we will continuously fail to meet the needs of women and all women. As women, we're not a monolith, and one-size-fits-all approaches simply don't work. They don't go far enough. Second, when it comes to eliminating issues of saviorism, a mentor's belief, so a sponsor, a mentor, an individual's belief, their assumptions, biases, can impact how they mentor and sponsor. So when an individual is motivated to lean into empathy, to lean into curiosity, to do the inner work, to engage in anti-racism work, and this is a process. It's not a one workshop situation. It takes time. But when they're really vested, they tend to be more inclined towards intentional advocacy as well as sponsorship of people, of women of color specifically. Now, if you know me, you know that I like real talk as well as meaningful solutions. And so if we can't honestly acknowledge the reality of what we're talking about, then we will never be able to remedy the issues. And I'm also a strong believer in collective action. Solving these problems and addressing these issues, these elephants, is not on the shoulders of one group, one person, one manager, or even one company. It's on all of us to challenge the status quo, unlearn white supremacy, and demand better. And that includes internalized white supremacy by many of us racialized individuals as well. So I want to end with a stat, a McKinsey report that stated 77% of employees report that they believe they're allies in the workplace, but of those, only 10% engage in mentorship or allyship of women of color specifically. So this is a stat that every single person in this room, me, you, all of us, has the power to change. And by the same account, that means that our inaction has the power to compound this stat significantly. When you leave here tonight, I want you to ask yourself a question. Am I helping to hide the elephant in the room, or am I helping to expose it? Examine your own behaviors and assumptions, and ask yourself, are you upholding white saviorism, or are we challenging white supremacy? And if the answers to these questions make you feel uncomfortable, I invite you to be curious, to lean into empathy, and to ask yourself how you are feeding the elephant. Just imagine how many lives all of us in this room could change today for a better tomorrow if we each committed to helping expose the elephant. Maybe if we each found one opportunity before the end of the year to be an active sponsor to Black, Indigenous, racialized women in our workplaces, imagine the combined impact we can have if we actually acknowledge the elephant in the room rather than disregard it. Thank you.